I told my lawyer the truth, Richard Whitmore said quietly, his voice echoing across the polished oak courtroom. So why does it feel like I'm the only one still fighting for it? The room was silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights above the federal courtroom on the 27th floor of the Manhattan courthouse, where a dozen reporters leaned forward in their seats, and the digital clock above the judge's bench ticked down another second toward what many believed would be the end of one of the city's most powerful men, Richard Whitmore. A billionaire known for building a tech empire that stretched from New York to Silicon Valley, stood alone at the defense table, his $2,000 tailored suit pressed perfectly, his posture rigid, yet the confidence that once filled boardrooms had quietly drained from his eyes as the heavy wooden doors behind him creaked open and his own defense attorney, Daniel Graves, walked straight out without looking back, the soft click of the closing doors sounding louder than a judge's gavel. The gallery murmured instantly, whispers rippling across the benches like wind across water, because lawyers did not abandon their clients in the middle of a federal hearing, not unless something had gone terribly wrong or terribly planned. Richard watched the door for a moment longer than he should have, his fingers tightening around the edge of the defense table, the polished wood cold beneath his hand, as if reminding him that money, reputation, and influence could not follow him into this moment. Across the aisle, Prosecutor Adam Pierce adjusted his tie slowly, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough to suggest he had expected this, as if the disappearance of Whitmore's lawyer was merely the final piece of a puzzle that had already been solved. The judge, Eleanor Brooks, a woman whose reputation for calm precision had shaped dozens of high-profile rulings over the past 20 years, leaned forward slightly in her high-back chair and tapped a pen against the legal pad in front of her, the sound sharp and measured. The sound of someone deciding whether a man still had a defense or not. Mr. Whitmore, she said evenly, her voice carrying across the courtroom with the weight of authority, your counsel appears to have left the proceeding. Unless another attorney steps forward, the court will have no choice but to proceed without representation. And those words landed like gravity, pressing down on the air until even the reporters stopped typing. Richard exhaled slowly through his nose, his mind racing through numbers, strategies, people he had trusted, people who had vanished the moment the accusations began. Because in the last 48 hours the man who once commanded billion-dollar negotiations had discovered that influence could evaporate faster than steam on winter pavement. In the back row of the courtroom, nearly invisible, among the quiet spectators, a young woman in a simple housekeeping uniform sat with her hands folded in her lap, the small silver name badge clipped to her collar catching the overhead lights whenever she shifted even slightly. Maya Carter had not planned to be in a federal courtroom that morning. Not when her shift at the Midtown Hotel started at 6 a.m., and the last thing she expected was to find herself listening to one of the most powerful businessmen in the country being dismantled piece by legal arguments she recognized far too well. She had come only to return a folder someone had left behind in the hotel lobby the night before, a folder that now rested quietly beside her on the bench, its thin stack of documents heavier than it looked because every page inside whispered the same thing her instincts refused to ignore. Up front, the judge glanced toward the empty doorway where Daniel Graves had disappeared, and for a moment the entire courtroom held its breath. Richard Whitmore straightened slightly, trying to reclaim a fragment of the confidence that had built his empire from a rented office no bigger than 200 square feet 15 years earlier. Yet even he could feel the truth pressing in from all sides that this was not a negotiation he could win alone. Somewhere behind him, a chair creaked softly as someone shifted their weight, and the faint sound carried through the stillness like a warning. Maya Carter lifted her eyes toward the front of the room, watching the billionaire stand alone while the system that had once applauded him now prepared to move forward without him. And the quiet thought forming in her mind felt reckless even to her, because the moment she opened the folder beside her and saw what had been overlooked, she realized something that nobody else in that room seemed willing to admit: the case against Richard Whitmore was not nearly as complete as everyone believed, and if no one said something in the next few minutes, the truth might never reach the bench at all. The silence in the courtroom stretched longer than anyone expected, the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that made every shifting chair and every turning page sound louder than it should. Judge Eleanor Brooks glanced once more toward the empty doorway where Daniel Graves had disappeared, then back to the man standing alone at the defense table, and the faint crease between her brows suggested that even she found the moment unusual. Richard Whitmore remained still, but inside his chest the rhythm of his breathing had begun to change, slow and controlled on the outside, faster beneath the calm surface he had trained himself to maintain through decades of negotiations and boardroom battles. Because this was different from any corporate conflict he had faced before. This was not about profit margins or market share. This was about a courtroom that no longer seemed interested in waiting for his side of the story. Across the aisle, Prosecutor Adam Pierce slowly gathered the folders in front of him with the quiet confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided, his fingertips smoothing the edges of the documents before he looked up toward the bench and said in a calm, measured tone that carried across the room, "Your Honor, if the defense has chosen to abandon representation, the prosecution is prepared to continue." The statement was simple, but the meaning behind it hung heavy in the air. Judge Brooks tapped her pen once against the desk. Again, the sharp click echoing softly through the chamber before she spoke. "Mr. Whitmore, do you have any other legal representation present in the courtroom today?" The question was formal, almost procedural, yet everyone in the room understood the answer before it came. Richard lifted his gaze toward the bench, and for a moment his usual composure faltered just enough to reveal the truth that had been forming in his mind since the door closed behind his attorney. "No, Your Honor," he said quietly. The words steady but undeniably final. The murmur that followed spread quickly through the spectators as reporters exchanged glances, and one of them scribbled something rapidly across a notebook, because the image of a billionaire without legal defense inside a federal courtroom was the kind of story that would reach every news network before the afternoon was over. In the back row, Maya Carter watched the scene unfold with a tightening knot in her stomach that had nothing to do with the quiet air conditioning humming above the ceiling tiles. The folder resting beside her felt heavier by the second. She had picked it up the night before while wiping down a marble counter in the lobby of the Midtown Grand Hotel, where Richard Whitmore had been meeting with several advisors in a private conference room. Someone had left the folder behind on the table after midnight, and Maya had done what she always did when guests forgot something important. She opened it long enough to check for a name so it could be returned properly. That was when she saw the documents inside. The legal language had not confused her the way it might have confused most people reading it for the first time. Years earlier, she had spent 3 semesters studying law at a community college in Atlanta before life interrupted those plans, before hospital bills and family responsibilities had forced her to exchange textbooks for a housekeeping uniform. Even now, the structure of legal arguments still made sense to her, in a way she could not easily explain. And the moment she read through the pages in that folder, she felt something strange, something that did not align with the confident accusations she had been hearing all morning in this courtroom. A small detail, hidden in the financial timeline, a number that appeared twice when it should have appeared once, a sequence of events that did not quite match the story being told at the prosecution table. Up front, Judge Brooks placed both hands lightly on the bench as she prepared to move the hearing forward, and her voice carried the steady authority of someone accustomed to guiding complex proceedings through difficult moments. "The court will allow a brief recess of 10 minutes, so Mr. Whitmore may attempt to contact alternative counsel," she said. "But if representation is not secured, the court will proceed." The words should have offered relief, but Richard knew 10 minutes would not change what had already begun to unravel. He nodded once, the movement subtle, then stepped away from the defense table as the courtroom slowly began to stir with quiet conversation. Maya looked down at the folder again, her fingers resting along the edge of the paper as the faint scent of cleaning solution from her morning shift still clung to the sleeves of her uniform. Part of her mind told her this situation had nothing to do with her, that a maid from a hotel did not interrupt federal court proceedings, that the people seated at the front of this room carried degrees, titles, and reputations that gave them the authority to speak. Yet another part of her mind refused to ignore what she had seen in those documents, the small inconsistency that no one else had mentioned once during the entire hearing. Across the room, Richard Whitmore stood near the empty defense table, staring down at the polished wood surface as though searching for an answer that refused to appear. The man who once negotiated billion-dollar contracts now looked like someone standing at the edge of a story that had already been written without him. Maya lifted her eyes again, toward the bench, then toward the quiet billionaire waiting beside the defense table, and a single thought rose slowly through the hesitation in her chest, clear enough now that it refused to disappear. If no one else noticed the mistake hidden in those pages, then the next 10 minutes might be the only chance left for the truth to be heard. The 10-minute recess began quietly, but the tension inside the courtroom did not ease the way a normal break would have allowed. Instead, the atmosphere felt heavier, as though everyone present understood that the next few minutes might determine the future of a man whose name had once appeared on the cover of business magazines across the country. Richard Whitmore remained near the defense table rather than leaving the room, his hands resting on the polished edge of the wood while his gaze moved slowly across the empty chair where his attorney had been sitting less than 15 minutes earlier. The absence of Daniel Graves now seemed louder than any argument that had been spoken during the hearing. Across the aisle, prosecutor Adam Pierce stood calmly beside his table reviewing documents with one of his assistants, the quiet confidence in his posture suggesting that the case no longer required urgency. Reporters whispered to one another near the back of the room, already imagining the headlines that would appear online before sunset. And in the last row, Maya Carter continued staring at the folder resting on her lap, as though the thin stack of paper had suddenly become a decision too large for someone like her to carry. She shifted slightly on the wooden bench, the faint creak beneath her weight sounding sharper than she intended. A security officer glanced briefly toward the back of the room before returning his attention to the hallway outside. Maya lowered her eyes again to the open page inside the folder, the columns of financial records printed in dense lines that most people would have dismissed as technical detail. But the more she looked at the sequence of numbers, the clearer the pattern became. One transaction appeared on March 15th at exactly 9:23 in the morning, transferring funds between two corporate accounts tied to Whitmore Technologies. The prosecution had presented that transfer as evidence that Richard Whitmore personally authorized an illegal financial maneuver designed to hide company losses. Yet the timestamp attached to the document did not align with the timeline described in the hearing. According to the testimony earlier that morning, Richard Whitmore had been speaking at a technology conference in San Francisco when the transfer was supposedly initiated from his office in Manhattan. Maya had noticed the inconsistency immediately when the prosecutor displayed the document on the courtroom screen. At the time, she assumed the defense team would address it within minutes, but they never did. And now the attorney responsible for raising that contradiction had walked out of the courtroom entirely. Maya exhaled slowly through her nose, trying to quiet the steady rhythm of her heartbeat as she looked up toward the front of the room again. Richard Whitmore had moved slightly closer to the tall windows along the side wall, where a pale rectangle of afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor tiles. The light reflected against the edge of the defense table and illuminated the side of his face, revealing the exhaustion he had worked carefully to conceal throughout the hearing. Maya had spent enough years working in hotels to recognize the subtle difference between a powerful guest giving orders and a powerful guest quietly realizing that no one was coming to help. The thought unsettled her more than she expected. She glanced down again at the document in her hands and traced the printed timestamp with the tip of her finger as if confirming the numbers had not changed. 9:23 Eastern Time. That meant 6:23 in the morning in California. The conference footage that reporters had been playing outside the courthouse earlier clearly showed Whitmore walking on stage shortly after 8 Pacific Time. The timeline simply did not match. Maya closed the folder halfway and leaned back against the bench, staring up toward the ceiling lights as if the answer might appear there instead of inside the pages she had already read 3 times. A voice inside her mind repeated the same warning again and again that she had heard since childhood. Stay quiet. Do not step into places where you do not belong. Do not draw attention from people who hold power you do not understand. Yet another voice pushed against that hesitation with equal persistence. The law was supposed to care about truth, and truth did not depend on titles or uniforms or the price of a suit. Across the room, Judge Brooks returned through the side door behind the bench, her black robe moving with calm precision as she resumed her seat and glanced briefly at the clock above the courtroom wall. The recess was nearly over. The low conversations in the gallery faded quickly as spectators settled back into silence. The judge adjusted a document on the bench and looked toward the defense table where Richard Whitmore had returned to his place alone. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "you secured legal representation." Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering quietly, "No, Your Honor." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath again. Maya felt the folder grow heavier in her hands as she realized the moment she had been avoiding was now directly in front of her. If the hearing continued without anyone mentioning the timeline error, the prosecution's argument would remain uncontested. The judge lifted her pen and prepared to move forward with the proceeding. And in that exact second, Maya Carter felt the quiet certainty settle inside her chest that silence would not allow the truth to survive this room. "I think the timeline is wrong." The voice came from the back of the courtroom, quiet but clear enough that the words cut through the stillness before anyone realized who had spoken. Judge Eleanor Brooks paused with her pen hovering above the legal pad, her eyes lifting slowly toward the rear benches where the spectators sat in orderly rows. A faint ripple moved through the room as heads turned in the same direction. Maya Carter had already stood up before her nerves could change her mind. The thin folder was still in her hands, pressed against the front of her housekeeping uniform, as though it might anchor her to the floor. For a brief moment, even she wondered if the words had truly come from her. The courtroom security officer near the wall shifted slightly, uncertain whether to intervene. Prosecutor Adam Pierce turned halfway around with a look of confusion that quickly sharpened into irritation. "Your Honor," he began, clearly assuming the interruption would be dismissed immediately, but Judge Brooks raised one hand before he could continue. Her voice remained calm, but carried a firm authority that instantly quieted the room. "Ma'am," she said toward the back row, "please identify yourself." Maya swallowed once before answering. "My name is Maya Carter, Your Honor." Her voice did not shake as much as she expected. The simple act of speaking seemed to steady her. The judge studied her for a moment, taking in the plain uniform, the silver housekeeping badge, and the folder clutched carefully in her hands. "And what exactly do you mean when you say the timeline is wrong, Miss Carter?" The question landed in the room like a spotlight. Dozens of eyes shifted between Maya and the defense table where Richard Whitmore now stood completely still. Maya felt the pressure of that attention but forced herself to continue. "The document presented earlier regarding the financial transfer," she said slowly, "the timestamp does not match the timeline described during testimony." A low murmur spread across the gallery again. Prosecutor Pierce frowned and turned fully toward the back of the room. "Your Honor, with respect, the court should not entertain commentary from spectators. The evidence has already been reviewed by legal counsel." Judge Brooks remained silent for a moment before responding. "Miss Carter," she said, "how did you come across the document you are referring to?" Maya lifted the folder slightly. "It was left behind in the conference room of the Midtown Grand Hotel last night. I work there. I recognized Mr. Whitmore from the news this morning and brought the folder to return it." I read the financial summary long enough to confirm the owner. Another ripple of surprise moved across the room. Richard Whitmore turned toward the back row slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to cautious curiosity. Maya continued before her courage faded. "The prosecution stated that the transfer occurred at 9:23 Eastern Time from Mr. Whitmore's office in Manhattan. However, Mr. Whitmore was speaking at a technology conference in San Francisco at that time. The broadcast footage shows him walking on stage shortly after 8 Pacific Time. That would make the transfer impossible for him to authorize from New York at the moment listed." The words hung in the air as if the entire courtroom needed a second to process them. Adam Pierce opened his mouth as though ready to respond, but hesitated when several reporters immediately began checking their phones. Judge Brooks leaned slightly forward in her chair. "Miss Carter," she said carefully, "are you suggesting that the timestamp presented in the prosecution's document conflicts with publicly verifiable footage?" "Yes, Your Honor," Maya replied. "The document says 9:23 Eastern Time. That is 6:23 in the morning in California. The conference video shows Mr. Whitmore already present on stage more than an hour later local time." The judge's gaze shifted toward the prosecution table. "Mr. Pierce, do you wish to clarify this discrepancy?" Pierce straightened slightly, adjusting the knot of his tie before answering. "Your Honor, the financial authorization could have been scheduled in advance. The defendant had full access to the corporate account. Maya felt her heart pound harder but forced herself to speak again. That possibility would appear in the system log, she said. Scheduled authorizations generate a separate confirmation record. The document in the folder does not show one. Another silence fell over the courtroom. Richard Whitmore stared at the young woman standing in the back row as though seeing her for the first time. Judge Brooks looked down briefly at the evidence summary in front of her before returning her attention to Maya. "Miss Carter," she said slowly, "do you have the document with you?" Maya lifted the folder slightly higher. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge leaned back in her chair, considering the room for a moment before speaking again. "The court will review the document in question. Please approach the bench." The instructions sent a wave of astonishment through the gallery. Maya hesitated only briefly before stepping into the center aisle, the quiet echo of her shoes against the courtroom floor marking each step forward as though the entire building had begun listening. Maya Carter felt every step echo across the marble floor as she walked down the center aisle toward the front of the courtroom. The thin folder held carefully in both hands as though it contained something fragile rather than a few sheets of printed paper. The quiet sound of her shoes against the tile seemed louder than it should have been, each step reminding her that she had crossed a line most spectators never approached. The security officer near the wall watched her closely but did not move. Judge Eleanor Brooks followed Maya's approach with steady attention, her expression thoughtful rather than impatient, the kind of expression that suggested she was already measuring the weight of what had just unfolded. At the defense table, Richard Whitmore remained standing, his eyes fixed on the young woman walking forward, trying to understand how a stranger in a housekeeping uniform had suddenly become the center of the most important moment in his trial. Maya reached the front rail, separating the gallery from the legal floor, and paused briefly before handing the folder to the court clerk, who looked uncertain for a moment before passing the documents up to the bench. Judge Brooks accepted the papers and adjusted her glasses slightly as she began scanning the page that Maya had referenced. The courtroom held its breath again as the judge read silently, her finger tracing the lines of the document with slow precision. Across the aisle, Prosecutor Adam Pierce shifted his posture, the confidence that had carried him through the earlier part of the hearing now edged with visible irritation. "Your Honor," Pierce said carefully, "the court should be cautious about placing weight on material that has not been formally submitted into evidence." Judge Brooks did not immediately respond. Instead, she turned the page once more, examining the timestamp printed beside the financial authorization record. The faint ticking of the wall clock above the courtroom door seemed suddenly louder as the seconds passed. Finally, the judge lifted her eyes from the document and looked toward the prosecution table. "Mr. Pierce," she said calmly, "the timestamp listed here reads 9:23 Eastern Time." "That is correct," Pierce replied, "and according to the prosecution's earlier presentation, this authorization required direct executive confirmation from the defendant's Manhattan office." "That is also correct," Pierce said. Judge Brooks rested the paper lightly on the bench before continuing. "However, the court is also aware that Mr. Whitmore was publicly scheduled to appear at the Pacific Technology Summit in San Francisco that same morning." Several reporters in the gallery immediately leaned forward as the judge spoke. Pierce opened his mouth as if preparing a response, but hesitated when the judge continued. "The footage from that event shows Mr. Whitmore addressing the conference shortly after 8 Pacific time. The document presented by Ms. Carter would place him initiating a transaction in New York more than 2,500 miles away, less than 2 hours earlier." Pierce adjusted the stack of folders in front of him and spoke again, attempting to regain control of the moment. "Your Honor, the defendant had the authority to authorize financial transfers remotely." Judge Brooks nodded slightly. "That possibility exists," she said. "But as Ms. Carter indicated, the document presented here does not contain the digital scheduling marker typically attached to remote or automated authorization records." The judge's words hung in the room like a quiet shift in gravity. Richard Whitmore felt the first unfamiliar flicker of hope move through his chest since the hearing began. He had noticed the inconsistency in the timeline days earlier, but trusted his legal team to raise the issue during the proceeding. When they did not, he assumed there must be an explanation he had not yet seen. Now the same discrepancy had been noticed by someone who had not even been part of the trial until minutes earlier. Maya remained standing beside the rail, her hands now empty, but her attention fixed on the bench as Judge Brooks continued reviewing the document. The judge turned one more page, then looked again toward the young woman. "Miss Carter," she said, "where exactly did you study?" "Legal documentation." Maya hesitated briefly before answering. "I took business law classes at a community college in Atlanta several years ago, Your Honor." The judge regarded her for a moment longer before glancing back toward the prosecution table. "Mr. Pierce," she said evenly, "the court will require clarification regarding this timeline discrepancy before proceeding further." Pierce nodded stiffly but did not hide the tightening expression along his jaw. The reporters in the gallery had already begun typing again, the quiet tapping of keyboards filling the space where certainty had existed only minutes earlier. Richard Whitmore turned slightly toward Maya, the faint sunlight from the tall windows reflecting across the floor between them, and for the first time since the trial began he understood that the person who had just shifted the direction of the entire case was not a lawyer, not an executive, but a woman who had simply refused to ignore something that did not make sense. The shift in the courtroom was subtle but undeniable, like the moment when a quiet wind begins to move before a storm changes direction. Judge Eleanor Brooks rested the document flat on the bench in front of her, her gaze moving slowly between the prosecution table and the defense side, where Richard Whitmore still stood alone, the faint reflection of the courtroom lights glimmering across the polished wood beneath his hands. The judge tapped the tip of her pen once against the legal pad, the sound soft but deliberate, a signal that the flow of the hearing had just changed. "Mr. Pierce," she said calmly, "the court will require additional clarification regarding the timeline presented in the financial authorization document." Prosecutor Adam Pierce adjusted his posture slightly before responding, attempting to maintain the same confidence he had displayed earlier in the proceeding. "Your Honor, the prosecution maintains that the defendant had full digital access to authorize the transfer remotely." Judge Brooks nodded once, but did not immediately write anything on the pad in front of her. "That possibility remains under consideration," she replied. "However, the court will not ignore a discrepancy raised within the record, particularly when the discrepancy involves the central timeline of the allegation." A faint murmur spread once again across the spectator benches, the reporters now fully attentive to the exchange unfolding before them. Maya Carter remained beside the railing where she had stopped earlier, her hands resting lightly together as she waited for the judge's instruction, uncertain whether she should remain standing or quietly return to the back of the room. Richard Whitmore glanced toward her again, studying the woman who had stepped forward from complete anonymity only minutes earlier and disrupted the direction of a federal trial with a single observation. The courtroom clock ticked steadily above the door as the judge continued reviewing the page one more time before lifting her eyes toward Maya. "Miss Carter," she said evenly, "please remain where you are for the moment." Maya nodded once without speaking. The judge then turned her attention back toward the prosecution table. "Mr. Pierce," she said, "the court would like to know whether your office has verified the digital origin of this authorization record through server location logs." Pierce hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. "Your Honor, the system records were obtained through the company database and submitted as evidence by the investigative team." Judge Brooks leaned back slightly in her chair, considering the answer before responding. "The document presented here indicates that the transfer request was processed through a direct executive terminal link to the Manhattan headquarters of Whitmore Technologies. If the defendant was physically located in San Francisco at the time indicated, the court will require technical confirmation regarding how the authorization was transmitted." Pierce opened one of the folders on his table and quickly scanned the contents before replying. "Your Honor, we can request a clarification from the financial compliance team." The judge nodded once. "You will do so. Until that information is verified, the court will not treat the timestamp as a conclusive record of the defendant's involvement." The words caused another ripple of quiet reaction across the courtroom. Several reporters began typing again, while one of them leaned toward a colleague whispering something that caused both of them to glance back toward Maya. Richard Whitmore exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly for the first time since the morning began. Yet even as the small shift in the case became visible, he understood that the trial was far from over. One discrepancy did not erase the charges against him, but it had introduced something the prosecution had not expected: uncertainty. Judge Brooks placed the document back onto the bench and folded her hands lightly together. "Miss Carter," she said after a moment, "the court appreciates the observation you have raised." Maya lowered her head slightly in acknowledgement. The judge then continued, "Although you are not a member of legal counsel, your statement has introduced a matter that must now be examined." Maya remained still, unsure whether the moment had ended or whether she had just stepped into something much larger than she originally intended. The courtroom waited quietly as the judge glanced once more toward the clock above the door. "Mr. Whitmore," she said calmly, "the court will allow this hearing to continue while the prosecution verifies the origin of the authorization record." Richard nodded once, his voice steady when he answered, "Thank you, Your Honor." Yet even as the proceedings prepared to move forward again, many eyes in the room continued drifting back toward the young woman standing beside the rail, because in a courtroom filled with attorneys, investigators, and corporate executives, the person who had shifted the course of the trial was someone who had simply refused to overlook a detail everyone else had ignored. The courtroom settled into a quieter tension after the judge's ruling, the kind of silence that no longer belonged to certainty, but to curiosity. People shifted in their seats, reporters adjusted their laptops, and several pairs of eyes continued drifting toward the young woman standing near the rail as though the room had not quite decided what to make of her yet. Judge Eleanor Brooks reviewed her notes briefly before looking back toward the prosecution table, her voice steady and deliberate. As she resumed the proceedings, "Mr. Pierce, you may continue with the next portion of your presentation while the court awaits clarification from the financial compliance team." Adam Pierce straightened his jacket before stepping forward again, though the rhythm of his movements now carried a slight hesitation that had not been present earlier. "Your Honor, the prosecution will proceed with the internal communication records between the defendant and several members of the Whitmore Technologies Finance Department," he said, lifting a folder from the stack on his table. The courtroom screen flickered softly as a series of emails appeared, lines of corporate language displayed in careful formatting that suggested planning, strategy, and financial discussion. Pierce began explaining how these communications indicated awareness of the financial transfer under investigation, his voice returning to the measured cadence of a practiced litigator. Yet the room no longer listened with the same unquestioned focus as before. Several reporters glanced repeatedly between the screen and the folder resting on the judge's bench. Even Richard Whitmore listened differently now, no longer standing beneath the weight of complete isolation but aware that a single overlooked detail had already shifted the ground beneath the accusations. Maya Carter remained near the rail, unsure whether she was still meant to stay there. But the judge had not dismissed her, and the security officer near the wall had not asked her to leave. She watched the screen as the emails appeared one after another, recognizing the familiar tone of corporate correspondence where words often carried meaning that depended more on timing than on what was actually written. One message from a finance director mentioned reviewing authorization logs. Another referenced waiting for confirmation from executive leadership. Pierce highlighted these phrases as though they formed a clear path leading directly to the defendant. But Maya noticed something else instead. The dates of several messages appeared 2 days after the transaction the prosecution claimed Whitmore personally authorized. The pattern was subtle, but it suggested that the finance department had been trying to understand the transfer after it occurred rather than before. She felt the same quiet pressure in her chest that she had felt earlier while sitting in the back row, the kind of pressure that came from recognizing a piece of information others seemed to be overlooking. At the defense table, Richard Whitmore leaned slightly closer to the screen, studying the messages with a different focus now that doubt had entered the room. He remembered those emails clearly, not because they proved his involvement, but because they had confused him at the time. His own finance team had contacted him asking questions about a transfer he did not recall authorizing. Before he could respond, the investigation had already begun. Prosecutor Pierce continued, explaining the messages as though they demonstrated coordination between Whitmore and his financial staff. However, Judge Brooks raised her hand lightly before he reached the next slide. "Mr. Pierce," she said, "please clarify the dates associated with the internal correspondence displayed on the screen." Pierce glanced at the monitor before answering. "The messages appear to have been exchanged on March 17th, Your Honor." The judge tilted her head slightly. "And the financial transfer under Review occurred on March 15th, according to the document submitted earlier. Pierce nodded once. That is correct. Judge Brooks leaned back slightly in her chair. Then these communications appear to have been written 2 days after the transaction in question. The observation drifted through the courtroom like another unexpected shift in the air. Pierce hesitated for a moment before replying. It is possible the staff was discussing confirmation procedures, Your Honor. Maya felt the quiet certainty return again as she watched the timeline form in her mind. Confirmation procedures usually happened before a transfer, not. 2 days later, Richard Whitmore noticed the same realization moving across the judge's expression as she studied the screen again. The prosecution's narrative had been built on the assumption that the timeline was simple and direct, yet with each new detail the story seemed to move slightly out of alignment. The reporters in the gallery began typing more quickly now, sensing that the case they had expected to document might be unfolding in a very different direction than anyone predicted only an hour earlier. The courtroom no longer felt like the controlled environment it had been that morning. Something subtle had shifted beneath the polished wood tables and marble floor, something that even the quiet hum of the ventilation system could not mask. Judge Eleanor Brooks studied the screen once more where the internal company emails remained displayed, her eyes moving slowly across the dates as though confirming the sequence again. March 17th, she said calmly, reading the header aloud. 2 days. After the transfer, Prosecutor Adam Pierce adjusted the folder in his hands before responding. Yes, Your Honor. Those messages show the financial department reviewing the transaction. The judge nodded slightly, but did not immediately look away from the screen. Reviewing a transaction after it occurred suggests uncertainty within the department rather than coordination beforehand. The observation settled across the room like a quiet weight. Several reporters immediately began typing again while others leaned forward to study the timeline displayed on the monitor. At the defense table, Richard Whitmore listened carefully, his attention shifting from the prosecution's presentation to the growing pattern forming across the evidence. He remembered the confusion inside his company during that week. His chief financial officer had contacted him while he was still traveling, asking about a transfer he had not personally approved. The conversation had lasted less than 3 minutes because the investigation began almost immediately afterward. Yet none of that context had been mentioned in the courtroom until now. Maya Carter remained beside the rail, watching the same screen with focused attention. The dates continued to bother her the more she considered them. Corporate financial departments rarely question transactions days after they occurred unless something about the record appeared unusual. She felt the same quiet certainty building again, the same instinct that had pushed her to stand up earlier. The judge rested her pen against the desk before turning toward the prosecution table. Again, Mr. Pierce, she said, has the court been provided with server authentication records confirming which terminal initiated the authorization request? Pierce hesitated briefly before answering. Your Honor, the investigative team obtained the financial summary, but the technical log verification is still pending. A faint murmur passed through the gallery once more. Judge Brooks folded her hands lightly together. If the authorization record cannot yet be confirmed through system logs, then the court must consider alternative explanations for the transaction. Pierce opened another folder and removed a printed sheet. Your Honor, the prosecution intends to demonstrate that only the defendant possessed the clearance level required to initiate the transfer. Richard Whitmore listened to those words carefully, recognizing the argument that had framed the entire case against him. Yet Maya noticed something else again while studying the document displayed on the courtroom screen. The email chain showed one additional name that had not been discussed: Daniel Graves, the same attorney who had quietly walked out of the courtroom earlier that morning. His name appeared in the message thread forwarded between members of Whitmore Technologies' finance department on March 17th. Maya felt her attention sharpen as she leaned slightly forward. The email referenced a legal consultation requested by the finance director 2 days after the transfer occurred. Graves had replied with a short instruction advising the department not to discuss the matter until investigators reviewed the transaction. The detail seemed small, but it carried a strange implication. Why would the company's external defense attorney be consulted about a transfer that the prosecution claimed Whitmore himself had authorized? Maya's thoughts moved quickly now as the timeline aligned in her mind. The transfer occurred on March 15th. The finance department noticed something unusual afterward. They contacted legal counsel on March 17th, and that same legal counsel had abandoned the defense earlier today without explanation. The coincidence felt too precise to ignore. Across the courtroom, Richard Whitmore noticed the judge's eyes pause briefly on the name appearing within the email thread. Judge Brooks tapped her pen lightly against the desk again before speaking. "Mr. Pierce," she said calmly, "please clarify the role of Daniel Graves in this correspondence." Pierce glanced at the screen before responding. Mr. Graves was serving as the defendant's legal advisor during the initial investigation. The judge nodded once, but did not remove her gaze from the document. "Then it appears that Mr. Graves was aware of internal concerns regarding this transfer before the charges were formally presented." Pierce shifted slightly, his confidence beginning to thin at the edges. "Your Honor, the legal advisor's involvement does not alter the substance of the financial record." Yet the courtroom no longer felt certain of that assumption. Reporters exchanged quick looks while the quiet tapping of keyboards resumed. Maya remained still beside the rail as the pattern continued forming in her mind. The man who had abandoned the defense earlier had known about the financial confusion from the beginning. And now the judge was looking at the same timeline that had first caught Maya's attention only an hour earlier. The name Daniel Graves lingered on the courtroom screen longer than anyone expected, the letters glowing softly against the large monitor while the room seemed to pause around them. Judge Eleanor Brooks studied the line of text with careful attention before shifting her gaze toward the prosecution table. "Mr. Pierce," she said calmly, "please confirm for the court whether Mr. Graves was acting solely as legal advisor to the defendant during the period reflected in these communications." Adam Pierce adjusted the folder in front of him before responding, his voice measured but slightly tighter than earlier in the hearing. "Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Graves represented Mr. Whitmore during the initial investigation conducted by federal authorities." The judge nodded once, but did not look away from the screen. "And yet, according to this correspondence, the finance department contacted Mr. Graves regarding concerns about the transaction 2 days after it occurred." Pierce cleared his throat softly before answering. "That appears to be the case, Your Honor." The quiet response drifted through the courtroom as reporters immediately began typing again, the sound of keyboards echoing softly through the gallery. Richard Whitmore stood motionless at the defense table while the timeline assembled itself piece by piece in the open air of the courtroom. He remembered that email exchange clearly now. His chief financial officer had mentioned that the legal department wanted to review the transfer before making any internal report. At the time, Whitmore assumed the process was routine. Yet hearing the timeline repeated aloud revealed something that had not been obvious before. If his own attorney had been aware that the finance department questioned the transaction, then Graves must also have known that the authorization record might not be as straightforward as it appeared. Maya Carter felt the same realization settling quietly inside her thoughts. She remained beside the rail where she had stopped earlier, watching the judge examine the screen once more. The more the timeline unfolded, the more the earlier events of the morning began to feel unusual. Graves had left the courtroom without warning only minutes before the hearing reached the evidence phase where the transaction details would be discussed. Maya remembered the moment clearly now. The attorney had gathered his documents quickly and walked out with a calm expression that did not match the urgency of the situation. At the time, it looked like abandonment. Now it looked different. Judge Brooks rested her pen lightly against the desk before speaking again. "Mr. Pierce," she said evenly, "when did Mr. Graves formally withdraw from representing the defendant?" Pierce glanced briefly toward the empty seat beside the defense table before answering. "This morning, Your Honor." Approximately 20 minutes before the hearing resumed, the judge raised her eyebrows slightly, and prior to that moment he had served as legal counsel throughout the investigation. "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom remained quiet as the implication slowly formed across the room. Richard Whitmore turned his head slightly toward the back of the courtroom where Maya still stood, realizing that the same question had begun forming in both of their minds at nearly the same time. If Daniel Graves had known the financial department questioned the transfer 2 days after it occurred, then he also knew the timeline was not as simple as the prosecution suggested. Yet he had not raised that issue during the early stages of the case. He had not presented the discrepancy during preliminary hearings. and this morning he had walked out moments before the court began examining the very evidence that revealed the inconsistency. Judge Brooks looked again toward the prosecution table. "Mr. Pierce," she said calmly, "has the court been provided with any explanation regarding Mr. Graves' departure from this proceeding?" Pierce hesitated slightly before responding. "Your Honor, Mr. Graves informed the court clerk that he had a professional conflict requiring immediate withdrawal from the case." The judge's expression remained neutral, but the pause that followed carried weight. Professional conflicts rarely appeared in the middle of a federal hearing without prior notice. The reporters in the gallery exchanged glances again, the story unfolding before them now, far more complex than the straightforward corporate fraud case they expected to cover. Maya looked toward the screen once more where the email chain remained visible. The message from the finance director on March 17th read, "Simply please advise whether we should escalate this transfer discrepancy." And the reply beneath it from Daniel Graves read, "Wait for internal confirmation before responding to investigators." Maya felt the quiet certainty grow stronger with each passing second. The attorney who had abandoned the defense earlier had not been surprised by the financial confusion inside Whitmore Technologies. He had known about it from the beginning. And now the courtroom was beginning to see the same timeline that had first drawn Maya's attention when she opened the forgotten folder the night before. The silence that followed the judge's last question felt heavier than anything that had happened earlier in the hearing, as though the entire courtroom understood that the case had quietly crossed into unfamiliar territory. Judge Eleanor Brooks rested her hands lightly on the bench while her eyes moved once more between the prosecution table and the empty chair where Daniel Graves had been sitting earlier that morning. The absence of the attorney now carried a different meaning, one that the courtroom had not considered when he first walked out. "Mr. Pierce," the judge said calmly, "the court will need to understand why legal counsel who was aware of internal concerns regarding the financial transfer chose not to raise those concerns during the earlier stages of this case." Prosecutor Adam Pierce adjusted his stance before responding, his voice still controlled, but no longer carrying the same easy certainty as before. "Your Honor, the prosecution cannot speculate on the internal strategy. Decisions of defense counsel." Judge Brooks nodded slightly, acknowledging the response, but the thoughtful expression on her face suggested the question had not been resolved. "The timeline before the court shows that Mr. Graves was aware of a discrepancy within the company records 2 days after the transaction occurred," she continued. "Yet that discrepancy was not introduced during preliminary hearings." Richard Whitmore listened carefully from the defense table, the pieces of the situation beginning to align in ways he had not previously considered. He had trusted Daniel Graves for nearly 8 years, long before the investigation began. Graves had represented his company during complex regulatory reviews and corporate negotiations. There had never been a reason to question his loyalty. Yet the moment Graves left the courtroom earlier that morning had already felt wrong, like the quiet snap of a thread holding something larger together. Now the emails displayed on the courtroom screen suggested that Graves had known far more about the internal confusion surrounding the transfer than he had ever revealed. Maya Carter remained beside the rail where she had been asked to stay, her attention fixed on the same timeline unfolding in front of the judge. She could feel the direction of the case shifting again, slowly but unmistakably. The email from the finance department on March 17th had been clear in its wording. "Please advise whether we should escalate this transfer discrepancy." And the reply beneath it from Daniel Graves had been equally clear. "Wait for internal confirmation before responding to investigators." The instruction had effectively delayed the company's response to the authorities who were already reviewing the financial activity. The delay might have seemed harmless at the time, but now it carried a different weight when placed beside the fact that Graves had withdrawn from the case just minutes before the hearing reached the very evidence he had once reviewed himself. Judge Brooks tapped her pen once against the desk again before continuing. "Mr. Pierce," she said, "has the court been provided with the original system authentication logs confirming which user terminal initiated the authorization request on March 15th? Pierce opened one of the folders on his table and flipped through several pages before answering. "Your Honor, the technical logs are still being verified by the Compliance Division." The judge nodded once. "Until those logs are reviewed, the court cannot treat the authorization record as conclusive evidence of direct involvement by the defendant." The statement caused a noticeable reaction across the gallery. Several reporters leaned toward their screens, while others quietly whispered to colleagues seated beside them. Richard Whitmore felt the air in the room change again, not dramatically, but enough that the crushing certainty of the earlier accusations no longer felt absolute. The prosecution's argument had relied heavily on the idea that the financial transfer clearly originated from Whitmore himself. Yet the timeline now suggested that even the company's own finance department had questioned the record before the investigation escalated. Maya watched the judge place the document back onto the bench and fold her hands again. The courtroom felt suspended. Between two versions of the same story, one presented earlier that morning and another slowly emerging through overlooked details, Judge Brooks finally spoke again, her voice calm but firm. The court will require the complete system authentication report associated with this transaction before continuing further with this line of argument. Mr. Pierce, please ensure that the Compliance Division submits that documentation promptly. Pierce nodded once, though the tightening of his expression made it clear that the prosecution had not expected the hearing to reach this point. The judge then glanced briefly toward Maya Carter before returning her attention to the courtroom. The young woman remained quietly beside the rail, her presence no longer an interruption but an undeniable part of the moment that had begun reshaping the entire case. The courtroom felt different now, not louder, not chaotic, but charged with a quiet tension that had not existed when the morning began. The earlier certainty that surrounded the prosecution's case had faded into something more cautious, something that forced everyone in the room to listen more carefully than before. Judge Eleanor Brooks reviewed the notes in front of her while the large courtroom screen slowly dimmed after the last document had been displayed. The silence stretched for several seconds before she finally looked up again toward the prosecution table. Mr. Pierce, she said evenly, the court will proceed with testimony while awaiting the system authentication report from the Compliance Division. Adam Pierce straightened his shoulders before nodding once. Yes, Your Honor. He turned slightly toward the witness stand where a man in a gray suit had been waiting quietly since the recess earlier that afternoon. The witness adjusted his glasses and walked toward the stand with careful steps, placing one hand on the railing as he sat down. For the record, please state your name and position, Pierce said. The man cleared his throat softly before answering. My name is Thomas Caldwell. I serve as Chief Financial Officer for Whitmore Technologies. The title immediately caught the attention of several reporters in the gallery, their fingers beginning to move quickly across their keyboards again. Pierce approached the witness stand slowly. Mr. Caldwell, he began, you oversee all major financial operations within Whitmore Technologies. Yes, Caldwell replied, including the transfer that occurred on March 15th of this year. Caldwell nodded. Yes. Pierce lifted a printed document and turned slightly so the courtroom could see it. According to your internal records, this transfer required executive authorization from the defendant. That is correct, Caldwell said carefully. Pierce glanced briefly toward Richard Whitmore before continuing. And when the transfer was discovered, your department initiated a review of the transaction. Caldwell hesitated slightly before answering. Yes. 2 days later. The judge's pen paused again above the legal pad as she listened. Pierce continued, and during that review you contacted the defendant's legal advisor, Daniel Graves. Caldwell nodded once. That is correct. Pierce paced slowly across the floor between the witness stand and the prosecution table. Did Mr. Graves instruct your department to delay reporting the discrepancy? Caldwell shifted slightly in his chair before responding. He advised us to wait until the internal records were fully confirmed. The courtroom absorbed the statement in silence. Maya Carter watched carefully from beside the rail, the same quiet pattern forming again in her thoughts. If the finance department had already questioned the transfer 2 days after it occurred, then the issue had never been hidden from the company leadership. Richard Whitmore listened closely to Caldwell's words, remembering the conversation clearly now. Caldwell had called him while he was traveling between conference events in California. The call had been brief, filled with uncertainty rather than accusation. At the time, Whitmore believed the issue would be resolved internally once the logs were reviewed. Yet the investigation had escalated quickly afterward, faster than anyone inside the company expected. Pierce placed the document back on his table before asking his next question. Mr. Caldwell, he said, During your review, did you personally verify which system terminal initiated the transfer authorization? Caldwell shook his head slowly. No, the authentication logs were still pending when federal investigators requested the financial records. Pierce paused for a moment before asking the next question, but the authorization record listed the defendant's executive terminal in Manhattan as the origin. Caldwell nodded. That is what the record indicated. Judge Brooks leaned slightly forward at that response. Mr. Caldwell, she said, when your department noticed the discrepancy 2 days later, did anyone inside Whitmore Technologies suggest that the transfer might have originated from a different terminal? Caldwell hesitated again, his eyes briefly lowering toward the edge of the witness stand before answering. Yes, Your Honor. The admission caused several reporters to glance up immediately. Judge Brooks waited calmly. Who raised that possibility? She asked. Caldwell exhaled slowly before answering. Our internal systems analyst noticed that the authorization time did not align with Mr. Whitmore's travel schedule. Maya felt the same quiet certainty tighten inside her chest again. The analyst had seen the same inconsistency she had noticed in the document the night before. Judge Brooks rested her pen once more against the desk. And what did Mr. Graves advise your department to do after that observation was raised? Caldwell hesitated only a second before answering. He told us not to discuss alternative explanations until the investigation was formally underway. The statement settled across the courtroom like a second shift in gravity. The attorney who had left the defense table earlier that morning had known from the beginning that the timeline surrounding the transfer did not match the story now being presented in court. The courtroom remained perfectly still after Thomas Caldwell finished speaking, as though the entire room needed a moment to absorb the implication of what he had just revealed. Judge Eleanor Brooks did not interrupt the silence immediately, allowing the statement to settle across the space where reporters, attorneys, and observers now understood that the case had reached a turning point no one expected earlier that morning. The judge slowly placed her pen down on the desk and looked toward the witness stand again. Mr. Caldwell, she said calmly, you testified that your internal systems analyst noticed the authorization time did not align with Mr. Whitmore's travel schedule. Caldwell nodded carefully. Yes, Your Honor. And that observation was made 2 days after the transaction occurred. Yes. The judge leaned slightly forward in her chair. When that discrepancy was identified, did your department attempt to verify the origin terminal of the authorization request? Caldwell hesitated. Briefly before answering, our team attempted to access the system authentication records, but the logs were locked under the external compliance review once the federal investigation began. The quiet explanation drew another ripple of attention through the courtroom. Judge Brooks turned her gaze slowly toward the prosecution table. Mr. Pierce, she said, has the Compliance Division now submitted the authentication logs requested earlier by the court? Adam Pierce opened a thin folder that had just been delivered by one of the court clerks moments earlier. He reviewed the first page quickly before responding. Your Honor, the Compliance Division has provided a preliminary authentication summary. The judge gestured toward the clerk. Please submit that record to the bench. The document was passed forward through the same quiet process that had carried the earlier evidence. When the paper reached the judge, she studied the contents carefully, her eyes moving across the lines with measured attention. Several seconds passed before she spoke again. The authentication record identifies the originating terminal for the March 15th authorization request, she said. The courtroom seemed to tighten around the statement. Richard Whitmore stood at the defense table watching the judge's expression closely while Maya Carter remained beside the rail, her hands folded lightly as she waited for the next words. Judge Brooks continued reading from the document. According to this report, the authorization request did not originate from the executive terminal assigned to Mr. Whitmore in Manhattan. A quiet gasp moved through the gallery before anyone could stop it. The judge looked up from the page. The request was initiated from a secondary administrative terminal located within the legal advisory office of Whitmore Technologies. The room fell silent again, but this silence carried shock rather than uncertainty. Prosecutor Pierce's expression stiffened as he glanced quickly toward the document in the judge's hands. Judge Brooks read the final line of the report aloud. The user credentials recorded at the moment of authorization correspond to the account assigned to Daniel Graves. The name echoed softly through the courtroom. Richard Whitmore closed his eyes briefly as the realization settled fully into place. The attorney he had trusted for nearly a decade had not simply known about the transaction discrepancy. The system logs now showed that the authorization itself had been executed through Graves' credentials. Maya Carter felt the quiet certainty she had carried since the night before finally resolve into something undeniable. The pattern she noticed in the forgotten folder had not been a coincidence. It had been the first piece of a timeline that the courtroom was only now seeing clearly. Judge Brooks rested the document on the bench before speaking again. "Mr. Pierce," she said evenly, "the court will require an immediate explanation regarding why the prosecution's earlier evidence identified the defendant's terminal as the origin point of this transfer when the authentication logs indicate otherwise." Pierce stood motionless for a moment, the careful structure of the case he had presented beginning to unravel under the weight of the new information in the gallery. Reporters were already typing rapidly, their screens glowing as the story transformed from a simple corporate fraud hearing into something far more complicated. Judge Brooks then looked briefly toward the young woman standing beside the rail. "Miss Carter," she said calmly, "it appears your observation regarding the timeline discrepancy has led the court to a significant discovery." Maya did not speak, but the quiet steadiness in her expression reflected the same truth that now filled the courtroom. The detail everyone else had overlooked had just exposed the real origin of the transaction that started the entire case. The courtroom did not erupt into noise the way dramatic moments sometimes do. Instead, the silence deepened, the kind of silence that carried the unmistakable weight of truth settling into place. Judge Eleanor Brooks kept her eyes on the authentication report resting on the bench for several seconds before she finally looked up again, her calm expression now sharpened by the gravity of what the document revealed. "Mr. Pierce," she said evenly, "the authentication record clearly identifies the legal advisory terminal associated with Daniel Graves as the origin of the authorization request on March 15th. The words seemed to echo softly across the chamber, repeating the name that had already begun to change the direction of the entire case. Prosecutor Adam Pierce remained standing at his table, his earlier confidence replaced by a careful stillness as he glanced once toward the empty defense chair where Graves had been seated earlier that morning. "Your Honor," Pierce said slowly, "the prosecution will need time to review the authentication data and determine how this discrepancy occurred." Judge Brooks nodded once, but her voice remained firm. "The court agrees that further review is required. However, the record now shows that the financial transfer under investigation was initiated through credentials belonging to the defendant's former legal counsel rather than the defendant himself." The reporters in the gallery continued typing rapidly, their keyboards producing a steady rhythm that filled the space where the earlier accusations had once dominated the room. Richard Whitmore stood at the defense table absorbing the moment with quiet disbelief. The weight that had pressed on his shoulders since the investigation began felt suddenly lighter, not because every question had been answered, but because the truth had finally begun to surface. He turned his head slowly toward the back of the courtroom, where Maya Carter still stood beside the rail, the young woman who had first noticed the inconsistency that set everything in motion. Maya remained composed, though the magnitude of what had just unfolded was clear in the thoughtful stillness of her posture. She had simply followed the timeline written in the forgotten documents she found the night before, yet that simple observation had now exposed something far larger than she imagined. Judge Brooks placed the authentication report neatly on the bench and addressed the courtroom once more. "In light of the information presented today, the court will suspend further argument regarding the alleged authorization until a full technical review of the transaction logs is completed." The judge paused briefly before continuing. "The prosecution is instructed to submit a complete analysis of the legal advisory terminal activity associated with Daniel Graves and its connection to the transfer in question." The statement drew another wave of attention from the gallery. As reporters exchanged quick glances, fully aware that the narrative surrounding the case had been fundamentally altered, Richard Whitmore exhaled slowly, the first genuine breath of relief he had taken since the hearing began hours earlier. He stepped back from the defense table and looked again toward Maya, the quiet gratitude in his expression unmistakable even across the distance separating them. Maya noticed the look and lowered her eyes modestly, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. but unable to ignore the strange path that had led her from cleaning hotel conference rooms to standing inside a federal courtroom at the center of a major legal revelation. Judge Brooks finally closed the folder containing the authentication report and rested both hands calmly on the bench. The court will reconvene once the Compliance Division completes its review of the transaction logs and the role of Mr. Graves is fully examined, she said. Until that time, the allegations against Mr. Whitmore cannot be treated as conclusively supported by the current evidence. The courtroom remained quiet as the meaning of that statement settled across the room. The billionaire who had stood alone at the beginning of the day now stood within a courtroom that had begun to see the case in a completely different light. And near the front rail, Maya Carter realized that sometimes the smallest detail in a forgotten document could reveal a truth powerful enough to change the direction of an entire story.